Head further north yet again as we look at the flood aftermath, and the death toll from flooding in southeast Queensland has risen to 12 now after a man's body was recovered from a vehicle in the South Burnett region. Attention now turns to the clean-up, of course, and flood mitigation strategies. Back in 2014, the Newman government launched studies into building 2 new dams and raising the height of the Wivenhoe Dam to better protect families in Brisbane and businesses and in Ipswich as well from major floods. Those reports were shelved by Labor after they won the election in 2015. The former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman joins me now live from Brisbane. He's, of course, now a Liberal Democrat candidate. Thanks for joining us, Campbell. You did a lot of work. I've seen the reports that your government did back in power looking at these options. Nothing had been decided. Nothing was set in concrete. But it doesn't look like much has happened since.
Well, I was also a former civil engineer, Chris, so I've taken a great deal of personal technical interest in flooding issues on the Brisbane River for many, many years. And indeed, that's why I warned in late 2010 of the potential for flooding in Brisbane. And I say with quite some sadness that Brisbane and the Brisbane River will flood again. And Ipswich will be affected as well if we actually don't start to get serious about looking at mitigation options. And there will always be floods and there'll always be that exposure. But my government did a pre-feasibility between April and December 2014 that found, as you just said, that we do have some options to actually better protect the residents. But sadly, nothing's happened. I mean, this was the report handed down in December 2014 that I released with my then Minister Mark McArdle that covered the raising of the Wivenhoe Dam by 4 metres, a dam at Linville, and also a flood mitigation dam on Lower Worrell Creek to the west of Ipswich, thereby providing significant benefits in terms of reducing the number of homes and businesses that could be flooded. But nothing's happened. Nothing at all has happened, Chris, and it really gets up my nose that we then see politicians continuing to sort of wring their hands. We need to build stuff. We need to build infrastructure.
But it's worse than that, though, Campbell. It's worse than that, Campbell, because we know, of course, in New South Wales for more than 2 decades, there's been talk about raising the height of Warragamba for flood mitigation purposes. So it's a similar scenario. Nothing's happened. But they haven't just built nothing. What they've done in Queensland and in New South Wales and other states, by the way, is they've spent billions building desalination plants. So they're building desal plants that they've never used, yet they've refused to build the dams that would mitigate floods.
Well, what I just mentioned was a strategy to also augment Brisbane's water supplies, and Brisbane's water supplies it might sound a bit strange for me to say this at a time of flooding, but I just say to Brisbane and South East Queensland residents, in the long term, Brisbane's water supply is not assured, because some important things the Beattie government were trying to do, like the Traveston Dam, a dam that wasn't built, knocked out on environmental grounds, meant that we didn't complete the strategy. I mean, what Labor did, by the way, Chris, is in 2019, so 5 years after I got to work with a purpose to build stuff, they released this nonsense. And if you want to get a complexion of what the problems are, there's a big section here on it talks about in this strategy in 2019 about the environmental benefits of floods. That's up. So I think there's a culture about not doing stuff. You mentioned Warragamba. I'll just add something on that, if I may. In 1986, as a graduate engineer, just joined the Australian Army Engineers, had my degree. I went to a presentation by the then Metropolitan Water, Sewage and Drainage Board in Sydney, and they spoke about the flood risk of Warragamba Dam. Back in those days, 36 years ago, they had identified the risk to houses between Penrith and Parramatta and along the Nepean and Hawkesbury. They'd identified it. They were calling for government to take seriously the need to provide mitigation works to raise the dam or build a flood mitigation dam, and nothing's happened. And this is the nature of Australia today. Politicians who want to do these glossy sort of documents with meaningless drivel, that never deliver anything. It's 8 years since I was determined to build infrastructure to protect people in Brisbane and Ipswich, and this Labor government's done nothing.
Every year wasted.
You can say the same thing for coalition. Coalition governments are also to blame.
You're singing my song. Thanks for joining us, Campbell. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Campbell Newman there. It is so clear. Now, last time I did some sums on this, the states have spent $12 billion or more building desal plants that have never been needed in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, but they won't build dams. No one can build dams to either preserve water for our use and for drought busting or to mitigate flooding, or both. Instead, they bought the lines from Tim Flannery that it would never rain again, so they built desal, and we're still paying for it. What a country.